the storm, and the stranger. The winter that year didn't just fall upon the Blue Ridge Mountains. It tried to bury them. Deep in the heart of the Appalachians, the cold was a physical weight, pressing down on the pines until they bowed in submission. The wind howled through the valleys, a hollow, lonely sound that cut right through to the bone. On a treacherous stretch of winding road, miles from the nearest paved highway, a solitary black truck fought against the deepening drifts. Behind the wheel sat Evan Cole. At 36, Evan was a man carved from silence and discipline. Years as a Navy SEAL had taught him how to occupy space without making a sound, how to observe everything while revealing nothing. He drove with one hand draped casually over the steering wheel, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the whiteout conditions with a focus that never truly slept. Beside him sat Atlas. The German Shepherd was 7 years old, a massive creature of black and tan fur, muscle, and intelligence. Usually, Atlas was the picture of calm, a statue made of discipline. But tonight, something was different. The dog suddenly stiffened. His ears swiveled forward, piercing the low hum of the truck's heater. A low, vibrating growl rumbled deep in his chest. Not aggressive, but urgent. Evan slowed the truck immediately. He trusted the dog's senses far more than he trusted his own eyesight in a storm like this. "What is it, buddy?" he murmured, leaning forward. Through the swirling curtain of snow, he saw them. At first, they looked like shadows, detachments from the tree line. As the truck crept closer, the shapes resolved into figures. Human figures. They were walking along the edge of the precipice, trudging through knee-deep powder with a slowness that terrified Evan. It was the pace of people who had forgotten how to stop, or perhaps knew that if they stopped, they would never start again. There were 3 of them, in a way. An elderly woman, frail and bent against the gale, clutching her coat closed with trembling hands. A younger woman, her arm wrapped fiercely around the elder's waist, practically dragging her forward. And between them, pressed tight against the old woman's chest, was a bundle wrapped in a tattered blanket. They didn't wave. They didn't look up. They were ghosts walking into oblivion. Evan brought the truck to a halt. The sudden silence of the engine dying was swallowed instantly by the wind. A memory punched him hard in the gut. His own grandmother, standing on a porch much like the ones in these hills, waiting for him to come home. He shoved the feeling down, opened his door, and stepped out into the biting freeze. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice nearly lost in the wind. "You can't be out here." The younger woman whipped her head around. Her face was pale, her lips blue, but her eyes held a fierce, defensive fire. She tightened her grip on the older woman. "We're fine," she yelled back, though the lie was so fragile it almost shattered in the cold air. Evan walked toward them, Atlas at his heel. The dog moved with fluid grace, positioning himself between Evan and the strangers, not to threaten, but to monitor. Evan saw the older woman's eyes then, glassy, unfocused, drifting. She was already in the early stages of hypothermia. "You're not fine," Evan said, his voice dropping to a calm, commanding register. "Get in the truck. Now." The younger woman hesitated, looking at Evan, then at the formidable dog, and finally at her mother. The older woman stumbled, her knees giving way, and that settled it. "Okay," the younger woman whispered. "Okay." Inside the cab, the heat blasted like a furnace. Evan cranked it up, watching in the rearview mirror as the 2 women huddled together in the back seat. The bundle in the old woman's arms shifted. A tiny, wet nose poked out, followed by a pair of frightened eyes. It was a puppy, no more than a few weeks old, ribs showing through matted fur, shivering so violently it shook the old woman's arms. "I'm Evan," he said, putting the truck in gear. "And the beast up here is Atlas." "I'm Lena," the younger woman said, her voice shaking as the adrenaline wore off. "This is my mother, Maggie. And the little one, that's Ash." "Where are you heading?" Evan asked, keeping his eyes on the treacherous road. Silence stretched out from the back seat, heavier than the storm outside. "Nowhere," Lena finally admitted, the words sounding like a defeat. We were trying to get to the shelter in the next town over. Our car died 3 miles back. Evan gripped the wheel tighter. 3 miles. In this weather, 3 miles was a death sentence. He didn't take them to a shelter. Instead, he drove them straight to a small veterinary clinic on the outskirts of the nearest town. The lights were still on, a beacon in the gray evening. He knew the vet, Dr. Price, and his head nurse, Nora. They were the kind of people who didn't ask too many questions when help was needed. Inside the clinic, the air smelled of antiseptic and coffee. Nora took charge immediately, wrapping Maggie in heated blankets and getting fluids into her. Dr. Price examined the puppy, Ash, who was placed on a warming pad. "He's tough," the doctor said, listening to the tiny dog's heart. "Malnourished and cold, but he's got fight in him." As the color began to return to Maggie's cheeks, Lena sat in the waiting room chair, her head in her hands. Evan stood by the door, arms crossed, while Atlas lay at his feet, watching the puppy with a curious tilt of his head. "We have no money to pay you," Lena said to the floor, her voice hollow, "and we have nowhere to go tonight. The shelters are full. I called before we left." Evan looked at them, really looked at them. He saw the worn-out shoes, the fear masked by exhaustion, the way Maggie reached out blindly to make sure the puppy was still there. He had come back to these mountains to sell his grandmother's cabin. It was an estate issue, just paperwork to him. The cabin was empty, cold, and sitting on a plot of land he intended to leave behind. But looking at Lena and Maggie, the paperwork seemed suddenly irrelevant. "I have a place," Evan said. Lena looked up, wary. "We don't know you." "No, you don't," Evan agreed. "But I have a cabin about 5 miles up the ridge. It's got a roof, a fireplace, and it's empty. I'm staying in the motel in town. You can use the cabin until the storm breaks." It wasn't entirely true. He had been planning to sleep at the cabin to save money. But he wasn't going to tell her that. Lena studied him, searching for a lie. She looked at Atlas, who was now letting the tiny puppy sniff his giant paw. The K9 let out a soft sigh and rested his chin on the floor, his eyes closing. "Dogs are good judges of character," Dr. Price noted from the corner, wiping his glasses. Lena exhaled, a long, shuddering breath. "Okay, thank you." The drive to the cabin was quiet. When they arrived, the structure loomed out of the darkness, a shadow against the trees. It was a sturdy place, built from logs that had stood for 80 years, but it was freezing inside. Evan unlocked the door and the group stepped into the stale, frigid air. "Stay here," Evan commanded gently. "I'll get the heat going." He went to the massive stone hearth, his movements efficient and practiced. Within minutes, a fire was crackling, casting dancing orange shadows against the log walls. The warmth began to bleed into the room, chasing away the damp chill of years of neglect. Maggie walked slowly toward the center of the room. Her eyes, clearer now, scanned the space. She ignored the dusty furniture and the cobwebs. Her gaze landed on the far corner, where a large wooden shape sat covered by a drop cloth. She walked toward it, her hand reaching out. She pulled the cloth back. It was a loom, an ancient, handcrafted floor loom, threaded with half-finished work that had been waiting for 5 years. Evan's grandmother's loom. Maggie touched the wood as if it were a holy relic. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Ash, the puppy, waddled over to the fire and collapsed on the rug, finally warm. Atlas took up a position by the door, ever the sentry. Evan stood by the fireplace, dusting soot from his hands. "There's wood out back. The well pump works. It's not much, but it's safe." He turned to leave, intending to head back to his truck and sleep there, but the storm outside slammed against the house with renewed fury. The wind shrieked, shaking the window panes. Lena looked at him, then at the window. "You can't drive in this," she said. "The road will be gone." Evan hesitated. He looked at the fire, at the old woman touching the loom, and at the 2 dogs, one giant, one tiny, already sleeping side by side. "I'll take the couch," he said quietly. And for the first time in a long time, the cabin didn't feel empty. The Weaver and the Guardian. Morning arrived not with a burst of sunlight, but with a quiet, gray illumination that filtered through the frosted windows. The storm had broken, leaving the world buried under 2 feet of pristine silence. Evan was up before the others. It was a habit drilled into him by years of service. Morning was for securing the perimeter. But here, the perimeter was just a sagging porch rail and a snow-covered driveway. He found a shovel in the shed and began clearing the path, the rhythmic scrape-toss of the snow feeling meditative. For a man used to holding a rifle, the shovel felt strangely heavy, yet the work quieted the noise in his head. Inside, the cabin was waking up. The smell of wood smoke mixed with the aroma of oatmeal boiling on the cast-iron stove. Lena moved through the kitchen with a tentative grace, trying to make do with the meager supplies Evan had retrieved from the back of his truck. Maggie was already seated by the fire. Ash the puppy was awake and testing his legs. He wobbled across the uneven floorboards, let out a tiny, high-pitched bark, and promptly tripped over his own paws. Atlas, lying near the hearth like a sphinx carved from granite, opened one eye. He didn't move as the puppy scrambled up and chewed enthusiastically on his ear. The massive German shepherd simply let out a long, suffering sigh and laid his head back down. It was a gesture of such profound patience that Evan, watching through the window, felt a tight knot in his chest loosen. By midday, the cabin had changed. It wasn't just a shelter anymore. It was beginning to hum with life. The loom in the corner beckoned to Maggie. She circled it for hours, her hands fluttering like nervous birds. Finally, she sat down. She looked at the half-finished weaving, the dust coating the threads. "It's loose," she murmured, her voice sounding younger than it had the night before. "The tension is all wrong." Evan stepped inside, stomping snow from his boots. "Can it be fixed?" "I think so," Maggie said. She pointed to a rusted bolt near the base. "That needs to be tight. And the warp beam, it's stuck." Evan retrieved a toolkit from under the sink. For the next hour, there were no words, only the sounds of metal on metal and wood groaning as it was adjusted. When Evan finally tightened the last screw, Maggie ran her hand across the strings. She plucked one.
Travis.
It hummed a
Descend
true,
now.
clear note. She picked up the shuttle. Her hands, which shook when she held a coffee cup, suddenly became steady. She threw the shuttle through the shed, pulled the beater back with a solid thwack, and repeated the motion. Swish, thwack, swish, thwack. The rhythm filled the cabin. It was the heartbeat of the house, a sound Evan hadn't heard in 5 years. He watched as the lines of worry on Maggie's face smoothed out. She wasn't a confused, elderly woman anymore. She was a craftsman at work. Lena stood in the doorway, her phone raised, recording the moment silently. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't make a sound. 3 days passed in this strange, suspended reality. They were snowed in, isolated from the world, and yet none of them seemed in a hurry to leave. Then the outside world came crashing back in. It started with the sound of an engine revving hard, too hard, up the driveway. Gravel crunched under aggressive tires. Atlas was on his feet instantly, his hackles raised, a low, menacing rumble vibrating in his throat. Evan moved to the window. A battered pickup truck had skidded to a halt near the porch. The driver's door flew open, and a man stepped out. He was big, wearing a thin jacket and a look of pure, volatile rage. Lena froze. "It's Travis," she whispered. The color drained from her face. "He found us." The banging on the door shook the frame. "Lena, I know you're in there. Open this damn door." Maggie stopped weaving. She clutched Ash to her chest, her eyes wide and terrified. Evan turned to Lena. "Stay back." He opened the door, not wide, but enough to fill the frame with his own broad shoulders. The cold air rushed in, clashing with the warmth of the fire. Travis stood on the porch, red-faced and reeking of cheap beer. "Who the hell are you?" he spat. "Where's my wife?" "She's not going anywhere with you," Evan said. His voice was terrifyingly calm. It wasn't the voice of an angry man. It was the voice of a man who had seen true violence and knew exactly how to dispense it. Travis laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "You think you can stop me?" That's my family. That old bat is costing me a fortune, and Lena is coming home. He took a step forward, his hand reaching for the doorframe to shove Evan aside. That was a mistake. A shadow moved from behind Evan's legs. Atlas stepped out onto the porch. He didn't bark. He didn't snap. He simply stood there, 85 pounds of apex predator. His teeth bared in a silent snarl. His amber eyes locked on Travis's throat. Travis froze mid-step. The primitive part of his brain, the part that feared wolves in the dark, screamed at him to stop. "The dog is trained," Evan said softly. "One wrong move, and you won't be walking off this mountain. You can't do this," Travis stammered, stepping back, his bravado crumbling. "I'll call the cops." "We already did." A voice came from the driveway. Two sheriff's deputies were walking up the drive, having parked their cruiser quietly at the bottom of the hill. A neighbor, seeing the strange truck speed by, had made the call. The older deputy, a man named Harris who had known Evan's grandmother, tipped his hat. "Everything all right here, Evan?" "Just a disagreement, Harris," Evan said, resting a hand on Atlas's head. The dog instantly relaxed, though he kept his eyes on Travis. Travis tried to spin a story, a tale of kidnapping and theft, but it fell apart the moment Lena stepped onto the porch. She stood next to Evan, trembling but resolute. "I'm not going back, Travis," she said clearly. "Mom isn't going to a home. We're done." The police escorted Travis off the property with a warning that if he returned, the charges wouldn't be a conversation. They would be a conviction. As his truck disappeared down the mountain road, the silence returned to the Blue Ridge. But it was a different kind of silence now. The fear was gone. Spring came slowly to the mountains. The snow receded, revealing the rich, dark earth and the green shoots of wildflowers. The video Lena had taken of Maggie weaving made its way onto the internet. It was a simple thing, just hands working thread, but it struck a chord. People saw the peace in it. Orders began to arrive. First a few, then dozens. Grandma Maggie's blankets became a small sensation. The community, initially wary of the strangers, rallied around them. A neighbor dropped off sacks of raw wool. Another offered to help Evan fix the porch railing in exchange for a scarf. The cabin, once a symbol of isolation, became a hub of warmth. Maggie was thriving. The routine of the loom, the presence of the dogs, and the safety of the cabin had anchored her memory. She still had bad days, but they were fewer. Ash, now a lanky, energetic adolescent dog, was her constant shadow. And Evan, the paperwork for the estate sale sat on the kitchen table for weeks. Every morning he looked at it. Every morning he found a reason to ignore it. The roof needs patching, he would tell himself. The wood needs splitting. One evening, the golden hour light was flooding the valley. Evan sat on the newly repaired porch steps. Atlas lay beside him, watching Ash chase a butterfly through the tall grass. Inside, the rhythmic clack thrum of the loom was a steady heartbeat. Lena was humming in the kitchen. Evan picked up the legal documents. They were crisp, official, and cold. They represented a clean break, a way to go back to a life of missions, deployments, and solitude. He looked at the mountains, turning purple in the twilight. He looked at the smoke curling from the chimney. He stood up, walked to the fire pit in the yard, and tossed the papers into the flames. He watched the ink curl and blacken, the words turning to ash and rising into the evening sky. He wasn't going anywhere. He had spent his life fighting for his country, but he had finally found something worth living for. Sometimes, miracles don't look like burning bushes or parting seas. Sometimes, they look like a frozen road, a stray dog, and a door open to strangers in a storm. God doesn't always change the weather to save us. Sometimes he just makes sure we find the right shelter and the right people to keep us warm until the sun comes back out. If you're watching this and you feel like you're walking through your own storm right now, just keep taking that next step. You never know who is waiting around the bend to open the door.